A flight attendant denies a cancer patient's simple meal request. 6 minutes later, she's fired on the spot. What triggered this shocking turn of events? And who was really to blame? You won't believe what happened next. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. A flight attendant, a busy airport, and a routine flight that quickly spiraled into a viral incident. Everything seemed normal as passengers boarded the plane, settling into their seats. But things took a turn when a particular passenger asked for special food due to his medical condition. What seemed like a small request soon set off a chain of events that no one on board could have predicted. A simple mistake, a refusal, and just 6 minutes later, one employee found herself out of a job. It all started when a passenger, a man battling cancer, asked the flight attendant, Emma, for a meal that met his dietary restrictions. He explained that his condition made it difficult to eat regular food, and he needed something specific. Emma, already running on a tight schedule with a busy flight ahead, took a quick look at her list of meals, saw what she had and told him, "Sorry, we don't have that option available." It wasn't that Emma was unwilling to help, but rather a misunderstanding. She assumed that the special meals were only for specific orders made in advance. The passenger, clearly uncomfortable, tried to explain his situation more urgently. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he was struggling. He had already been through a lot, and this was supposed to be a quick, calm flight. Yet in that moment, the refusal hit hard. He was frustrated, embarrassed, and the confusion started to build between them. Other passengers started to notice. A couple of them murmured, their eyes shifting from the man to Emma. The tension was in the air. Emma didn't realize that this simple conversation was going to become the start of a much bigger issue. But before she could even finish her rounds, things began to escalate. Just minutes after the exchange, a supervisor arrived. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Emma wasn't sure what had happened, but the next thing she knew, she was being told to step aside. 6 minutes. That's all it took for the situation to go from a small misunderstanding to a fired employee. Emma didn't know what hit her. One simple interaction had turned everything upside down. The confusion didn't stop there. While Emma tried to process what had just happened, the passenger, still hungry and upset, quietly muttered his frustration to the other passengers nearby. His condition had made him more sensitive to situations like this, and it didn't help that his request was dismissed so quickly. What had been a misunderstanding was now turning into a bigger issue, and the tension on the plane grew. Emma stood to the side trying to figure out what to do, but things were happening too quickly for her to keep up. Within moments, the supervisor took charge. It wasn't just about the meal anymore. Emma's actions, or inactions, had triggered something larger than a simple meal request. In the meantime, word of the incident began to spread, and whispers filled the cabin. Other passengers were starting to feel uneasy. Some were sympathetic toward the passengers' medical needs, while others, unsure of what had exactly happened, began to form their own opinions. Emma's supervisor, Paul, had a stern look as he spoke to her. No one could really hear their conversation, but the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The man who had asked for the meal wasn't demanding anything extreme. He simply needed something that could accommodate his medical condition. Yet, somewhere along the way, the airline's procedures collided with real human needs. Emma tried to explain, but before she could get a word out, Paul was already walking away with a decision made. It wasn't long before the flight attendant was informed that her services would no longer be required that day. The words came harsh and fast. She was being let go. Emma couldn't believe it. She was stunned, and the decision seemed to happen so fast it almost felt unreal. There was no time to argue or explain. Emma had done what she thought was right in that moment, but it wasn't enough. And just like that, 6 minutes passed, and the flight that started out like any other was now marked by a surprising turn of events. The passenger, unaware of the chain reaction his request had set off, could only watch as Emma walked away. Her head hung low, trying to process what had just unfolded. As Emma left the cabin, she walked through the narrow aisles, her mind racing. Her thoughts were a blur, but one thing kept coming back to her. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? She hadn't meant to upset anyone. She had followed what she thought were the standard procedures. But now it felt like those very rules had betrayed her. She didn't have much time to dwell on it, though. The flight continued, passengers still quietly whispering, but no one dared to speak up directly. The mood on the plane was tense, but for the most part, everyone tried to go about their business. The cancer patient who had sparked the entire incident sat quietly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen either. All he wanted was a meal that would help him get through the flight, but now it felt like he was in the middle of something far bigger than he had intended. Meanwhile, back in the airline's operations room, a storm was brewing. The decision to fire Emma had already been made, but the fallout was far from over. A few passengers had taken to social media, posting about the incident almost immediately after the flight took off. The initial posts were more about surprise, sharing the strange turn of events. Flight attendant fired mid-flight. The reactions flooded in quickly. Some were supportive of Emma, feeling that the situation was blown out of proportion, while others backed the airline, arguing that procedures needed to be followed for safety and consistency. But soon, the discussion shifted. What started as a small post here and there grew into something much larger. People began debating not just Emma's actions, but also the broader issue of how airlines treat passengers with medical conditions. Some questioned the lack of flexibility in such a sensitive situation, while others criticized the airline for not having clear policies in place for situations like these. The news spread fast. Local outlets began picking up on the story, and soon, national media jumped in. Emma, unaware of the media frenzy brewing outside the cabin, couldn't shake the feeling that she had been caught in something much bigger than a simple mistake. The phone calls came next. Her manager reached out trying to calm things down, but the damage was done. The viral nature of the incident couldn't be undone. She was no longer just an employee of the airline. She was part of a much larger conversation about customer service, empathy, and the policies that govern the airline industry. What had seemed like a small issue on a routine flight had quickly turned into a public relations nightmare. The news of Emma's firing spread across social media like wildfire. As the story gained traction, it began to take on a life of its own. People from all over the world were now weighing in on what had happened. Some supported Emma, saying she was just doing her job and that the situation was blown out of proportion. Others sided with the airline, arguing that rules and procedures should be followed without exception. But as the public debate grew, something else emerged. A deeper, more uncomfortable question about the airline's policies and how they dealt with passengers who had special medical needs. The cancer patient's story was shared repeatedly, and while the public largely sympathized with his health struggles, many were also angry at how the situation was handled. Some began questioning why such a simple request, one that could have been handled with a little empathy, had spiraled out of control. The media quickly picked up on the issue, and soon, experts in customer service and hospitality were offering their opinions on the situation. Many pointed out that while rules are important, there needs to be a balance between following procedures and recognizing the humanity of the people you're serving. The airline, under intense pressure, released a statement explaining their side of the story. They claimed that Emma's refusal to serve the special meal was due to an oversight in policy, and that employees were simply following standard procedures. But the statement did little to calm the storm. In fact, it seemed to make things worse. The public didn't buy the idea that Emma's firing was solely due to a simple mistake. The story had evolved beyond the incident itself. It was now a symbol of how larger institutions sometimes fail to consider the individual needs of their customers. Emma's case became a rallying point for many who felt that customer service in general was often rigid and impersonal. By now, the pressure on the airline was immense. News outlets were demanding answers, and social media was flooded with people calling for a boycott. Emma, though she hadn't intended to start a revolution, had inadvertently become the face of a growing movement that questioned corporate accountability, empathy, and the importance of clear communication. The airline's public relations team was scrambling to deal with the fallout, while Emma, now at home, watched as her life became the center of a nationwide debate. As the days passed, Emma's phone buzzed constantly with messages, friends, family, even strangers reaching out. Some offered support, others criticized her decision. The weight of the situation settled in. She had lost her job, but in some ways, it felt like the loss wasn't the biggest thing. The story, now widely circulated, painted her as the villain in a tale where the airline's policies clashed with human compassion. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She had become a symbol of a larger issue, one that had nothing to do with her individual actions, but everything to do with a system that prioritized rules over flexibility. The media attention had grown, and soon, interviews were being offered to Emma. Some were sympathetic, while others wanted to twist her story to fit a narrative. Emma was caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had never expected any of this. At the heart of the whole incident was one simple moment of misunderstanding, a miscommunication about food, yet it had sparked outrage, public debates, and scrutiny on a level she never could have anticipated. Her life had been upended, and now, it seemed, she was being asked to explain herself to a world that had already formed an opinion about her. The cancer patient, too, was caught up in the aftermath. He spoke to reporters, explaining how the incident had affected him. Though his health was still a priority, he admitted that he felt torn between wanting to help Emma and wanting to be understood himself. It was clear that neither of them wanted the drama. They simply wanted things to go smoothly. But the reality was, the incident had done more than just draw attention to an airline's customer service policies. It had exposed cracks in a system that, for many, seemed too rigid and too focused on profit over the individual needs of passengers. As the debate continued to rage, Emma found herself in a difficult position. On one hand, she understood the anger that many felt about her firing. It seemed unjust and rushed. On the other, she knew the airline was in a tough spot, needing to protect its image and follow the rules that kept things running. But what about the human element? What about the cancer patient who had simply asked for a meal? Emma couldn't help but think that there had to be a better way to handle the situation. Was there room for empathy in a world so focused on policies and procedures? And if there was, could things have turned out differently for her? The questions hung heavy in her mind as the story played out across every screen. As the public debate continued, it became clear that the fallout from the incident wasn't going to die down anytime soon. The media storm had gained so much momentum that the story became something far bigger than a single event on a flight. It became a symbol of the growing frustration many felt with large corporations and their often rigid, impersonal policies. Emma found herself being constantly approached for interviews, but each time she sat down to talk, the words didn't come as easily as she had hoped. She didn't have a clear answer, no neat explanation. She was just a person who had made a mistake, tried to follow the rules, and found herself at the center of a storm she couldn't control. Meanwhile, the cancer patient, whose name had become synonymous with the incident, also faced his own share of attention. Though he never wanted the spotlight, he couldn't ignore the fact that the attention on him was far from just about his medical condition. People had started to talk about how he had been treated, not just by Emma, but by the airline as a whole. The issue wasn't just about the food. It had quickly become about how people, especially those with health conditions, were treated by corporations that seemed more concerned with following procedures than offering real care. The man explained that he had only wanted a meal that he could eat comfortably on the flight, but now, he was caught in a whirlwind where his health and needs were almost secondary to the larger issues of corporate responsibility and employee treatment. It was around this time that the airline issued an official statement, though it did little to settle the chaos. They acknowledged that Emma's firing was a result of her failure to adhere to their protocols. However, they also expressed regret that the situation had escalated as it did. The statement came off as half-hearted, as if the company was trying to patch things up without truly understanding the root cause of the issue. They claimed to be reviewing their policies and training programs, But the damage was already done. Public trust in the airline was faltering, and Emma's abrupt firing left many wondering if the company cared more about protecting its image than about the people who worked for it. Emma's family and friends, who had seen her as a hard-working, kind person, now had to watch her struggle with the weight of an entire public narrative that didn't seem to fit her reality. She had always been the type to follow the rules, to do her job well, and to help passengers in any way she could. But that day, things had gone wrong, and she was paying the price for it. It wasn't just her job at stake. It was her reputation, her livelihood, and her sense of self. But even as Emma struggled with her own feelings of injustice, she couldn't help but feel sympathy for the cancer patient who had been caught in the middle of all this. She hadn't meant to refuse him food. She had only been following the guidelines that she had been trained to follow. In her mind, she wasn't the villain. She was just an employee trying to do her job in a world that demanded perfection, even in moments of human error. Yet the system had failed both of them, her, the cancer patient, and countless others who had experienced similar issues. As the story grew, so did the public's desire for answers. People started to demand better treatment for passengers, especially those with special needs. They wanted to know why such a simple request for a meal couldn't be met. They questioned why someone like Emma, who had never been in trouble before, had been fired on the spot for what many saw as a minor mistake. And perhaps most importantly, people wanted to know if the airline would truly learn from this. Would it continue to prioritize policies over empathy? Or was this an opportunity to make a change, to offer a better experience for everyone, not just the ones who followed the rules? For Emma, the days after the incident felt like an endless cycle of interviews, social media posts, and online debates. She had hoped that things would quiet down, but they only grew louder. She was left with one thought that kept her up at night. Had she made a mistake? Or had she just been the unfortunate person who became the face of a much larger problem? As weeks passed, the initial shock of Emma's firing faded into the background, but the questions it raised lingered. The public's outrage didn't die down. If anything, it intensified. Online petitions began circulating, demanding accountability from the airline. People from all walks of life, not just passengers, began voicing their opinions. A growing number of people, including customer service experts, medical professionals, and even some employees from within the airline industry, came forward to offer their perspectives. Many experts pointed out that the core issue wasn't Emma's actions. It was a deeper systemic failure. Airline policies, they argued, were often designed without considering the human element, especially in emergency situations or with passengers who had special needs. The airline industry, as a whole, had built itself around efficiency, schedules, and minimizing costs. While that was necessary for running a large company, it often came at the expense of personal care. The truth was that systems like these didn't always leave room for flexibility or empathy, two things that could have made all the difference in Emma's case. Had the airline been more accommodating to passengers with medical conditions, perhaps the issue could have been resolved before it escalated. But Emma's situation wasn't just about the system failing her. It was also about her personal struggle to reconcile what had happened. The more Emma thought about the incident, the more it weighed on her. She replayed the moment in her head over and over. The passenger's request, her refusal, the exchange that quickly spiraled out of control. At times, she questioned herself. Had she been too rigid? Should she have bent the rules? After all, what harm would it have done to accommodate the man's special request, given the circumstances? She felt torn between two realities, the one where she was just doing her job, following company guidelines, and the one where her decision had led to a public spectacle that left her without a job. Both sides felt valid, but neither offered her a clear sense of closure. For the cancer patient, the aftermath was similarly complicated. While he didn't want to be caught in the middle of a public dispute, he couldn't ignore the fact that Emma's firing didn't sit well with him either. He understood, better than most, how frustrating it could be to feel like a person's needs were being dismissed. After all, He had just asked for something as simple as a meal to help him through his flight. But when the media started to focus on him, he realized that the situation had become a lot bigger than anyone had intended. It wasn't just about food or Emma's mistake anymore. It was about how we treat people with special needs, about how companies often prioritize efficiency over individual care. In one of the few public statements he made after the incident, the passenger explained that he wasn't angry at Emma. He didn't hold a grudge. He simply wished things had been handled differently, with a little more understanding. He emphasized that the airline could have easily avoided the situation by making the necessary accommodations or offering an alternative. But instead, it had become a headline. And now he was left to reflect on the bigger picture. It was a reminder that, for people living with illnesses, the smallest things could often become the biggest obstacles. A meal on a flight shouldn't be one of them. As the story continued to dominate the media, the airline started to feel the pressure. Public perception was changing rapidly. In a desperate attempt to salvage their reputation, the airline issued another statement. This time, it wasn't just about defending their actions or explaining policies. They acknowledged the public's frustration and admitted that the situation could have been handled better. They promised to review their customer service training, particularly when it came to special requests and emergency situations. But by then, many people had already made up their minds. The damage was done. People weren't just upset with how Emma was treated. They were upset with a system that seemed to ignore human needs in favor of rules and regulations. Behind the scenes, Emma struggled to understand how her life had changed so drastically. She had always prided herself on being a hardworking, responsible employee. She wasn't perfect, but she did her job well, and she genuinely cared about helping passengers. Now she was left questioning everything she thought she knew about the airline, her career, and even herself. The person she had been, the dependable, rule-abiding employee, no longer seemed to exist. In a way, she felt like a casualty of a larger issue, one that was beyond her control. But even as the story raged on, she couldn't help but wonder, could there have been a better way to handle the situation? Would it have made a difference if she had been given more time to think, if the airline had supported her more? In the end, though, those questions didn't matter. What mattered now was the way people viewed the incident, and the changes that were beginning to take place. Not just within the airline, but across the industry as a whole. Emma's firing had opened up a conversation about the cost of policies and procedures, and whether they were worth it if they led to moments like these. The weeks following the incident brought an unexpected shift in the narrative. Emma, now out of work and grappling with the consequences of her actions, began receiving messages of support from all over. Some were from former colleagues, others from complete strangers who saw her as a symbol of the larger issue in the airline industry. They shared their own experiences, stories of rigid policies and systems that failed to accommodate the real needs of customers. Many saw Emma not as a villain, but as a victim of a broken system, one that prioritized rules over empathy and human connection. Yet, despite the growing number of supporters, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she had let everyone down. The guilt lingered, especially when she read some of the harsher comments online. Some people were unforgiving. They called her unprofessional, criticized her for not handling the situation better, or blamed her for the public outcry. The conflicting opinions made it harder for Emma to form a clear perspective on the situation. Should she accept the support from those who felt she was unjustly fired? Or should she take responsibility for the way things escalated? Every day she wrestled with these questions, trying to find some sense of closure. Meanwhile, the cancer patient, whose needs had sparked the entire incident, found himself in a position he never wanted. His health struggles had already made his life challenging enough, and now he was caught in a media frenzy that he hadn't asked for. He had become a symbol for those advocating for better customer service in the airline industry. But for him, the incident had started as a simple request, a meal that fit his dietary needs. It was supposed to be a routine, uneventful flight. Instead, it had turned into a spectacle that dragged him into a debate he didn't want to be part of. He never imagined that his need for a specific meal would lead to a viral story, protests, and a growing public outcry. As more interviews with him aired, it became clear that his feelings about the incident were mixed. On one hand, he understood the anger that many felt about Emma's firing. She had acted within the constraints of her job, and while her decision was unfortunate, it wasn't malicious. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the fact that the airline had failed him. In a moment when he was vulnerable, they didn't take the time to understand his needs. His request wasn't unreasonable. It wasn't about asking for something extravagant. It was simply about getting the right food for his medical condition. Yet, in the end, he had been left without the meal he needed, and Emma had lost her job because of it. Despite the media frenzy, he was careful not to point fingers. Instead, he used his platform to push for a broader conversation. He talked about how people with medical conditions often found themselves at the mercy of systems that didn't understand their specific needs. Airline policies, while important for safety and efficiency, were often blind to the nuances of passengers' personal situations. He spoke out about the importance of flexibility and empathy in customer service, particularly when it came to vulnerable people. The more he spoke, the more people began to listen, not just to his story, but to the deeper issues it highlighted. The airline, facing mounting pressure, released another statement in an attempt to shift the narrative. This time they acknowledged that there were gaps in their policies and procedures when it came to passengers with special needs. They admitted that they had failed to offer the flexibility required in such a situation. They promised a review of their training programs and said they would implement changes to ensure that similar incidents would be handled more compassionately in the future. But by this point, the damage had already been done. The public wasn't just angry with Emma's firing, they were upset with an entire system that seemed too focused on adhering to rules, rather than understanding the unique needs of individual passengers. In the weeks that followed, the conversation expanded beyond just this one incident. It became part of a larger discussion about customer service across all industries. People began questioning whether businesses were truly serving their customers, or simply going through the motions of providing a service without any real regard for the person on the other side. The story of Emma and the cancer patient became a case study, one that raised important questions about what happens when rules clash with humanity. For Emma, this period of reflection was both difficult and eye-opening. She had always been someone who prided herself on following procedures, on doing things by the book. But now, she saw how that very rigidity had cost her. She had been too focused on the rules and not enough on the people involved. She realized that while policies were necessary, there had to be room for compassion, especially when dealing with passengers who were vulnerable or in need. The incident had exposed her own blind spots, and she couldn't help but think about how she would approach similar situations in the future. As the dust began to settle, Emma found herself questioning not just the airline's policies, but the larger culture in which they had all operated. Could things have been handled differently? Absolutely. But in hindsight, it wasn't just about one meal or one flight. It was about a systemic issue that affected both the passengers and the employees. The truth was, things had gone wrong because of a lack of flexibility, a lack of understanding, and a lack of humanity. And now, with everything out in the open, the real question was, could the airline and others learn from this? Or would it be another missed opportunity to change? As the debate continued, more voices joined the conversation, and the ripple effect of Emma's firing became more apparent. The issue, which had started as a single incident between a flight attendant and a passenger, quickly evolved into a broader critique of customer service standards, particularly within large corporations. While the media frenzy had eventually quieted, the underlying tension remained. People were no longer just talking about Emma or the cancer patient. They were now questioning the fundamental approach that companies had toward their employees and customers, especially when it came to handling sensitive situations. At the heart of the issue was the realization that policies, while necessary for structure and efficiency, were often too rigid to accommodate the unpredictable nature of real-life situations. The airline had followed its procedures to the letter, but those procedures had failed to take into account the unique circumstances of a passenger with a medical condition. The refusal to provide a special meal wasn't just about food. It represented a deeper problem: the inability of many institutions to adapt and show empathy in moments of crisis. People began to ask, why is it that an employee like Emma, who was simply doing her job, is punished so severely for a minor mistake? And why do companies prioritize policies over the well-being of their customers? As the conversation gained traction, some industry experts pointed out that customer service training often lacked the necessary tools for employees to navigate the emotional complexities of their jobs. In many cases, employees were taught to follow rules strictly without ever being taught how to deal with the nuances of human behavior. Customer service representatives, flight attendants, and others on the front lines were often faced with situations where emotions ran high, yet they were rarely equipped to manage those emotions effectively. The incident with Emma highlighted this gap in training. She wasn't equipped with the knowledge or resources to handle a situation where compassion should have taken precedence over procedure. For the airline, the fallout was far from over. Their attempts to smooth things over with public statements and promises of change were met with skepticism. Many people felt that the airline was more concerned with salvaging its image than with making meaningful changes. It wasn't enough to simply apologize and offer a review of policies. They needed to demonstrate that they understood why the situation had happened in the first place. What was the point of revising procedures if the same underlying issues weren't addressed? What good were new policies if the company culture didn't change to support them? In response, a wave of advocacy groups began pushing for more consumer rights protections. These groups argued that businesses needed to be held accountable for their treatment of vulnerable passengers, especially those with medical conditions. They pushed for clearer guidelines on how companies should handle special requests, especially in emergencies. Their goal was not just to change policies within airlines, but to create a standard across industries for how customer service should be provided to people with special needs. They called for training programs that focused on empathy, emotional intelligence, and critical thinking, skills that would allow employees to make decisions on the fly, based on the specific needs of each individual customer. Meanwhile, Emma struggled to move on. She had been offered a few job opportunities here and there, but none of them felt right. It wasn't that she didn't want to work, it was that she didn't know where she belonged anymore. The public narrative about her had been set, and she had no idea how to undo the damage. She wasn't just an ex-flight attendant, she was the face of a larger controversy, and no matter how much she wanted to distance herself from it, the story seemed to follow her everywhere. But as time went on, Emma began to reconsider the narrative she had been forced into. She realized that while she couldn't change what had happened, she could influence how the story ended. She started speaking out, not just to defend herself, but to highlight the broader issue. She joined conversations about the lack of emotional intelligence in customer service training, offering her own perspective on how small mistakes could snowball into larger problems when employees didn't have the tools to manage them. It wasn't easy to put herself back out there, especially after everything that had happened, but Emma understood that the conversation needed to keep moving forward. Slowly, Emma became a part of a growing movement advocating for change. She began collaborating with others in the industry who were calling for a more empathetic approach to customer service, especially when dealing with passengers with special needs. Emma's personal experience gave her a unique voice in the conversation. She wasn't just talking about abstract issues, she had lived them. Her involvement helped bring attention to the importance of revising customer service policies to allow for more flexibility, compassion, and understanding. The cancer patient, too, continued to use his platform to speak on behalf of passengers with special medical needs. His message had always been simple. Companies needed to be more flexible and compassionate when dealing with people like him. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was asking for basic understanding and accommodations. As the months passed, he too started to become a symbol of a larger movement for change. His story, which had started with a small meal request on a flight, had grown into a rallying cry for better treatment of vulnerable passengers. The airline, under increasing pressure, finally took more concrete steps to implement changes. They revamped their customer service training programs to include more emphasis on empathy and communication skills. They also introduced new guidelines for handling special requests from passengers with medical conditions. But many still felt that the airline's efforts were too little, too late. The damage to their reputation couldn't be easily undone. While some praised the airline for making changes, others remained skeptical. Would they actually follow through, or would this all be forgotten in time? Emma's story had started as one isolated incident, but in the end, it sparked a larger conversation about the shortcomings and how companies treat their employees and customers. It wasn't just about a flight attendant being fired. It was about the failures of a system that was too rigid, too focused on efficiency, and not focused enough on the human side of the equation. Emma's experience, though painful, helped to shine a light on these issues, and while she couldn't erase the past, she knew that she had played a part in pushing for change. And in a world where empathy often took a backseat to efficiency, that was something to be proud of. Months had passed since Emma's firing, but the story was far from over. What had seemed like a one-off incident had transformed into a larger conversation about customer service standards, corporate responsibility, and the importance of empathy in business practices. Emma had managed to find a quiet corner in a crowded world of opinion, but her journey had left her with far more questions than answers. She had become a symbol of a conflict larger than herself, and while it was hard for her to shake off the events that had led to her downfall, she began to realize that she could still take control of the narrative in her own way. Though the media had moved on, and the public's attention had shifted to other scandals and stories, Emma was left dealing with the aftermath of being thrust into the spotlight for something she never expected. It was a bizarre mix of guilt, empowerment, and frustration. She had been wronged, but she was also forced to face uncomfortable truths about herself and the system she had worked for. The public's outcry had helped her understand that the real issue wasn't just about one meal or one employee. It was about a deep-rooted flaw in the way that businesses treated customers and the employees that served them. Over time, Emma began to speak publicly about her experience, though it wasn't easy. Her words were more measured now, reflecting a deeper understanding of the complexities at play. She'd learned, often the hard way, that a company's culture could make or break a situation. Her firing had been a result of a policy that prioritized uniformity over judgment, and it had cost her not just her job, but her dignity. However, Emma chose to focus on the lessons rather than the loss. In her speeches and interviews, she shared her story not to cast blame, but to start a conversation about what needed to change in the airline industry and in corporate America in general. She wasn't just telling her own story anymore. She had become a part of a larger movement that demanded a shift in customer service. She highlighted the need for policies that allowed employees to think critically and empathetically, especially when dealing with vulnerable individuals. People had responded to her story because, at its core, it was about human beings and the way they are treated. Emma's experience echoed the struggles of so many workers who felt powerless in systems that were too rigid, too focused on following rules instead of helping people. She spoke to employees everywhere, urging them to find their voices and demand more flexibility in how they handled customer interactions. The cancer patient, too, continued his own advocacy. Though his health remained his top priority, the media attention surrounding his story had led him to use his platform for something bigger. He spoke about his need for medical accommodations and pushed for awareness of how companies could better meet the needs of passengers like him. However, he was also careful to make it clear that this wasn't about getting special treatment. It was about recognizing the needs of individuals who weren't always visible in the corporate mindset. His message had always been simple, but now it carried more weight. He wasn't just advocating for himself. He was speaking on behalf of anyone who had ever felt invisible or dismissed by the system. Their stories, combined with the growing pressure on companies to improve customer service, eventually led to small but significant changes in industry standards. In response to the growing demand for better treatment of passengers with medical conditions, airlines across the country started to implement better training programs. They began educating their staff on how to deal with special requests and how to handle emergency situations with compassion and care. For the first time, there was a concerted effort to address the real challenges that passengers with medical needs faced when flying. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a step forward. Yet despite the strides made by some companies, Emma knew that the road ahead would be long. The systemic issues she had faced in her own career weren't going to disappear overnight. She could see the changes being made, but it would take years before they truly became ingrained in the culture of corporate America. More companies had started to recognize the importance of empathy in customer service, but there was still a long way to go. It was clear that changing a culture that had been built around rules and efficiency wasn't going to happen with a few policy changes or statements. It required a fundamental shift in how businesses viewed both their employees and their customers. For Emma, the journey was a slow one. She found a new job in a completely different field, away from the airline industry. The transition wasn't easy, and it took time for her to feel like she had found her footing again. But the lessons from the past stayed with her. She no longer saw herself as just a cog in a machine. She saw herself as someone who could influence change, no matter how small. She knew that her story had touched a nerve with people, and that gave her the drive to keep pushing for change, even if it was in a different way than she had originally planned. Her experience had taught her that the lines between right and wrong aren't always clear, especially when it comes to workplace policies. She'd learned that the human element could never be ignored, and that no matter how well-intentioned the rules might be, they were only as good as the people who enforced them. She had seen the consequences of an over-reliance on rigid systems, and had become an advocate for a more balanced, empathetic approach. Over time, Emma's voice became part of a larger conversation about the importance of emotional intelligence in business. She advocated for policies that allowed employees to think for themselves and make decisions based on human understanding, rather than just protocol. As she began to speak more about her own experiences, she realized that she had become part of a movement, not by choice, but by circumstance. It was a movement that challenged companies to rethink how they treated both their employees and their customers. And while it had come at a great personal cost, Emma found solace in knowing that her story had sparked a much-needed conversation. In the end, Emma understood that no one could change the past, but everyone had the power to shape the future. The lessons learned from her firing and the fallout that followed had reshaped her, and through her efforts, she hoped to inspire others to fight for a more compassionate and empathetic world, one where human needs were just as important as policies. The months following Emma's transition out of the airline industry were a blend of growth, reflection, and new challenges. Though she had moved on from the job that had defined her career for so long, the events of that fateful flight continued to shape her path. The media spotlight, though dimmed, had left behind lasting ripples. Emma's voice, once just a quiet part of a team, had now become an instrument of change in a larger discussion about how companies treated their employees and customers. The pressure to be perfect, something she had internalized during her years as a flight attendant, had almost broken her, but it had also fueled her to seek a new, deeper understanding of the world around her. She had grown frustrated with how easily systems could discard people when they made mistakes. But more importantly, she had learned that there were far greater forces at play, forces that shaped the ways we interact with each other, especially in professional settings. Emma had witnessed firsthand how a simple lapse in communication could escalate into something far more damaging than anyone could have imagined. Her mistake, a misunderstanding about a meal request, had cost her job, but it also opened her eyes to how often businesses placed policies and bottom lines above human needs. It was these insights that led her to begin speaking out more actively. Emma wasn't looking to become a spokesperson for a cause. She had never planned on being in the public eye. But the response to her firing made it clear that the story was bigger than her. She felt a responsibility to not let the conversation die. She started reaching out to advocacy groups focused on worker rights, customer service reform, and corporate accountability. In a sense, she found a new calling. She began speaking at conferences, sharing her experience with employees from other industries who had been in similar situations. Her voice was one of authenticity because she wasn't simply giving a speech. She was sharing the truth of what had happened to her and how it had changed the way she saw the world. Her talks weren't just about what had gone wrong with her firing, though. They were about what needed to change on a systemic level. She began to focus on the importance of emotional intelligence in customer service roles, especially in industries where human interactions were at the forefront, like airlines, hospitality, and retail. She discussed how businesses could train their employees to not only follow procedures, but also listen, empathize, and make informed decisions that took into account the humanity of the situation. Emma had seen firsthand how a lack of training in these areas could cause ripple effects that hurt not only customers but employees as well. It was here that Emma's own personal healing began. For the first time since the incident, she began to see the events of that flight from a broader perspective. She wasn't just the victim of a broken system. She was part of a conversation that was about creating a better world for everyone, both employees and customers. Her experience became a rallying cry for those who had felt powerless in the face of corporate bureaucracy. Through her speeches, she connected with people who had felt their own frustrations with businesses that failed to consider their needs or the needs of the people they served. Meanwhile, the cancer patient, whose own plight had sparked the incident, was also making his own strides. After the media frenzy had died down, he continued to advocate for better accommodations for people with medical conditions. His message remained simple. People with health needs weren't asking for special treatment. They were just asking for basic dignity and understanding. He had made his voice heard in the months following the incident, speaking at forums, participating in interviews, and reaching out to groups focused on disability rights and accessibility in public services. The connection between Emma and the cancer patient had, in some ways, been forged through a moment of misunderstanding, but it had grown into a mutual understanding of the systemic issues that plagued customer service. The cancer patient, too, found solace in the broader conversation about empathy and the human side of business. He had never intended to become a symbol of change, but the incident had made him realize how important it was for people in positions of power, whether in companies or in government, to understand the daily struggles of those with health challenges. He started working with organizations focused on improving accessibility in public spaces, including airlines, hospitals, and government buildings. The more he spoke about his experience, the more he realized that his voice had power, and that it wasn't just about one airline. It was about a societal shift in how people with medical conditions were treated in all areas of life. While the airline had made some changes in response to the public pressure, many felt that the shift was superficial. They had introduced new training programs and promised to review their policies. But for many, these actions weren't enough. Emma knew this all too well. The corporate world was often slow to change, especially when it came to changing company cultures that had been in place for decades. Despite the airline's attempts to move on from the incident, many passengers and employees still viewed the company's efforts as insufficient. The public was left wondering if the changes were genuine or just a reaction to the bad press. For Emma, it was clear that the changes needed to be deeper and more meaningful. She began speaking more about the need for companies to embrace a culture of empathy, not just within customer service departments, but throughout the entire organization. It wasn't enough to have a few well-intentioned policies on paper. There needed to be a shift in the way companies thought about their relationship with both employees and customers. Businesses had to realize that the human element was not just a side note. It was at the core of what made them successful. Without it, there was no real connection, and no real loyalty from either employees or customers. Emma's message was simple. Systems could be fixed, policies could be revised, but without real cultural change, nothing would last. She shared her story to show how easily things could go wrong when companies failed to adapt, and how important it was for them to listen to the people they served, not just the bottom line. she realized that while she may have lost her job, she had gained something far more valuable: a sense of purpose. In the years that followed, Emma became an advocate for change, a voice in a growing movement that called for businesses to put people before policies. As the story of Emma and the cancer patient faded from the headlines, their efforts to make a difference continued. Both had found their place in a larger movement, a movement for more compassionate, human-centered business practices. The road ahead was still long, but they knew they had already started something. It wasn't just about changing one airline. It was about changing how all businesses interacted with their customers and employees. And through it all, Emma realized that even in the midst of failure, there could be growth. And from growth, real change could emerge. As Emma continued to navigate her new life and the newfound sense of purpose, she encountered moments that challenged her resolve. The momentum from her talks, interviews, and advocacy began to spread. But there were also setbacks. She quickly realized that while she had sparked a conversation, turning that conversation into tangible, lasting change would be much more difficult than she had ever imagined. The corporate world, though increasingly aware of the demand for more empathetic policies, was slow to embrace the kind of deep transformation she had in mind. Emma's sense of urgency was only heightened by the stories she heard from other workers, particularly in industries like retail, hospitality, and healthcare, where employees were often faced with situations where they were expected to follow rigid policies, even when those policies failed to serve the customer's needs. It became clear that this wasn't just about one airline or one industry. It was a wider issue, a cultural blind spot in businesses that prioritized efficiency over the people they served. Emma's frustration grew as she continued to meet with employees from other industries who felt just as trapped by corporate policies as she had. They shared stories of customers with special needs being ignored, health conditions being disregarded, and difficult situations being handled with cold bureaucracy rather than care. As Emma listened, she realized that the scale of the problem was far larger than she had first thought. This wasn't just about advocating for employees to have more empathy. It was about fundamentally shifting how businesses interacted with people in distressing or vulnerable situations. Her own advocacy efforts began to evolve as a result. What had initially been about speaking out for herself, defending her actions, explaining her firing, now expanded into a call for a systemic overhaul. She started working with organizations that focused on worker advocacy, mental health in the workplace, and corporate accountability. Her approach was no longer just about changing the way one company or industry operated. It became about changing the very ethos of how business was done. Emma's talks were no longer only about the importance of empathy, though that was still a central theme. She began to talk more about power, how corporations wielded power over both employees and customers, and how that power was often used to enforce rules that disregarded the lived experiences of people. As Emma's ideas evolved, so did the movement around her. More and more people joined her cause. Workers who had been silenced by corporate rules, customers who had been mistreated by faceless systems, and even other companies that were looking to make meaningful changes to their culture. Emma was invited to sit on panels, meet with corporate leaders, and even consult with businesses that were trying to implement more humane, people-first policies. Despite the challenges, Emma found herself in a unique position. She had become a thought leader in a movement that was gaining steam. But there was still so much to be done. In her personal life, Emma started to see how her advocacy work was beginning to change her own outlook. Where once she had been someone who followed rules without question, now she found herself questioning everything. About the systems that had shaped her, about the things she had been told to accept as just the way things were. She began to see the value in taking risks, in pushing back against the norms that didn't serve the greater good. But even more, she saw how important it was to give others the space to speak up as well. In her meetings with other employees, especially those in low-wage, customer-facing jobs, Emma came to realize just how much unspoken frustration existed in the workforce. These were employees who wanted to help, wanted to serve their customers with care, but often found themselves trapped in a system that didn't allow for it. As Emma continued to reflect, she started to understand that what had happened to her wasn't just about one flight attendant losing her job. It was about the breakdown of communication between employers and employees. It was about how the corporate world had become a machine that valued consistency and profit above all else, often at the expense of personal dignity. She had been one of many casualties of this machine, but Emma's position gave her a unique opportunity to do something about it. She was now in the trenches of advocacy, actively working toward shifting the narrative in corporate America. Around this time, a breakthrough moment occurred. Emma was contacted by a major business consultancy that had been following her advocacy work. They were looking for someone to lead a new initiative focused on integrating empathy into corporate culture. The initiative, called Human-Centered Business, would work with companies across various industries to help them rethink how they treated both their customers and their employees. It would focus on fostering understanding, emotional intelligence, and flexibility in customer service. And it would emphasize a cultural shift within companies, one that prioritized people over profit in moments that really mattered. It was a turning point for Emma. The offer was exactly what she had been working toward all along, a chance to bring real change to the corporate world from within. For the first time since her firing, she felt like she had an opportunity to directly impact the very system that had caused her downfall. This was her chance to do more than just advocate from the outside. She could now be a part of the change itself. Emma accepted the position, and with it came a new set of challenges. The work was demanding, and it required her to think strategically, something she hadn't done much of when she was working as a flight attendant. But this new role allowed her to focus on the bigger picture. She wasn't just helping one company or one employee. She was helping multiple organizations reshape their policies, their culture, and their approach to customer service. She found herself working with leaders who had once seemed unreachable, helping them understand that a shift toward empathy and understanding didn't have to mean sacrificing business goals. In fact, the more businesses focused on the needs of their employees and customers, the more successful they could be. However, the work was not without its resistance. Emma encountered CEOs and board members who were skeptical, who saw empathy as a soft skill that didn't belong in the boardroom. There were companies that balked at changing their policies because they were too entrenched in their old ways, or because they feared that introducing too much flexibility would lead to chaos. It was hard for Emma to come to terms with the reality that not everyone was ready for change. But she had come to learn that transformation, real transformation, took time. It required persistence, compromise, and a willingness to meet people where they were. As Emma settled into this new role, she found herself reconnecting with the passion that had driven her to this point. Her focus was no longer solely on her own experience, but on creating spaces for others to share their stories too. She facilitated workshops for employees in various industries, helping them find their voice and learn how to advocate for themselves when they encountered situations that didn't feel right. She worked closely with HR departments to develop training that included emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, and active listening. Emma had come a long way from the flight attendant who had once only followed the rules. She was now someone who was actively reshaping the rules, working to create a business world where people mattered more than profits, where understanding, empathy, and connection weren't just buzzwords, but the foundation of a better, more sustainable way of doing business. And as she continued to lead the charge for this shift, Emma realized that the incident that had once felt like the worst thing that had ever happened to her had, in fact, been the catalyst for something much bigger. It had opened her eyes to the larger issues in the workplace and beyond, and had given her the strength to become a voice for change. Her journey had come full circle, from a mistake that cost her everything to a mission that could change the way companies operate, one conversation at a time. Looking back on everything that had transpired, Emma couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. What started as a simple misunderstanding, a meal request made by a cancer patient, had become the defining moment of her life. It was a moment that had shaken her to her core, and one that at the time felt like an ending. But as the months turned into years, Emma saw how it had actually been the beginning of something much more significant. Her story, which had once felt like a personal tragedy, was now a story of transformation, not just for her, but for countless others who had found themselves in similar positions. Through it all, Emma had learned to redefine her relationship with failure and success. She no longer viewed failure as the end of the road. Instead, she saw it as a necessary part of growth. It was a lesson that many people didn't learn until much later in life: how to face setbacks head-on, understand their root causes, and use that knowledge to propel themselves forward. Emma had been forced to face her failure in the harshest way possible, but the very thing that had nearly destroyed her had also sparked a drive within her to build something new, something better. Her work with human-centered business had blossomed. What had begun as a consultancy initiative with just a handful of companies now spanned multiple industries: retail, healthcare, transportation, even tech. More and more organizations were recognizing the value of empathy in their operations, not just as a feel-good slogan, but as a real driver of customer satisfaction, employee loyalty, and long-term success. Emma was no longer speaking just to raise awareness. She was actively shaping the future of business culture. Companies were beginning to understand that fostering a human-centered approach wasn't just a moral imperative, it was a business advantage. Satisfied, loyal employees led to satisfied, loyal customers. And in turn, that led to greater profits, lower turnover, and stronger reputations. Emma's work with businesses helped to break down barriers between management and employees. She advocated for policies that gave employees more autonomy to make decisions based on empathy and the specific needs of customers. She pushed for the creation of support systems within companies that empowered workers to speak up when something wasn't right, and to advocate for customers, especially those with special needs. By focusing on communication and understanding, she helped companies realize that being more human wasn't a threat to their bottom line, it was a pathway to success. But it wasn't just companies that Emma had impacted. She also became an advocate for workers' rights, in a way that she had never imagined. Through her talks, she reached countless employees in customer-facing roles who felt voiceless, trapped in jobs that required them to follow strict procedures that often conflicted with their personal values. Emma's message to them was clear: you are not just an extension of a company's policies, you are a human being with your own instincts, needs, and judgments. By encouraging employees to trust their instincts, to think critically in difficult situations, and to recognize the humanity in the people they served, Emma was helping to create a shift in workplace culture that valued workers' judgment and emotional intelligence. In addition to her work with companies, Emma also became an advocate for policy reform, pushing for labor laws that would give employees more power in customer service roles, especially those in positions like flight attendants, retail workers, and other frontline employees, who often had to make on-the-spot decisions that impacted customer satisfaction. She worked with labor unions and advocacy groups to propose new regulations that would help protect workers from being punished for making judgment calls that, in hindsight, could be considered mistakes. She argued that these workers needed better legal protections, especially in industries where policies often didn't account for the complex human nature of the situations they faced daily. The cancer patient, too, had found a renewed sense of purpose. While his health remained a priority, his experiences following the flight incident had ignited a passion for advocacy that he hadn't realized he had. He worked alongside Emma on many of the initiatives aimed at improving accommodations for people with medical conditions, particularly in the travel industry. Together, they helped create guidelines for airlines and other transportation companies on how to better handle passengers with special needs. Guidelines that focused not only on physical accommodations but also on emotional sensitivity and understanding. His involvement in the movement gave his experience a sense of meaning and purpose that went beyond his own personal struggle. He wasn't just advocating for himself anymore. He was advocating for anyone who felt invisible or disregarded because of their health conditions. Through Emma's collaboration with the cancer patient and countless other advocates, a broader movement began to take shape. It was a movement that challenged corporations to rethink how they valued human dignity, not just profits. They weren't asking for special treatment. They were asking for a baseline of respect and understanding, for policies that could be flexible enough to accommodate the complexities of real human lives. Slowly but surely, their efforts began to yield results, as more businesses adopted human-centered strategies and began rethinking how they treated both their employees and their customers. Emma also found herself reflecting on the personal growth she had undergone since the incident. What had initially felt like a public shaming had become, in hindsight, the turning point that made her a better person, a stronger leader, and a more empathetic advocate. She had learned to see the nuances in every situation, to understand that life wasn't just black and white, and to appreciate the power of kindness and flexibility in a world that often demanded conformity. There were moments of doubt, of course. She still encountered resistance from people who thought her message of empathy and flexibility was too idealistic, too soft. But over time, Emma learned that the world didn't change overnight. Change took persistence, commitment, and a willingness to face challenges, even when the road seemed uncertain. Every small victory, the businesses that signed on to her initiatives, the employees who thanked her for giving them a voice, the customers who reported better experiences, reinforced the belief that this movement was worth fighting for. Emma's journey had come full circle. What started as a single incident had blossomed into a global conversation about corporate empathy, human rights in the workplace, and customer-centered service. Through her advocacy, she had helped create a world where people mattered more than policies, where companies recognized that their success was intrinsically tied to the dignity and well-being of those they served. Looking back, Emma knew that the story of the cancer patient's meal request was no longer just about one person's mistake or one company's failure. It was a catalyst for a broader shift, one that had affected change in countless industries, companies, and lives. And as Emma stood at the forefront of that change, she could finally say, with confidence, that what had initially felt like a devastating end had become the start of something much greater, something meaningful, something that had the power to make a real, lasting difference. If you found this story interesting, give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.